Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final episode of the Crowell and Dunleavy Labor and Employment Seminar for this year. It's been an unusual year, of course. We're used to seeing you all in a big ballroom and having lunch together and enjoying each other's company. And unfortunately, that just wasn't possible this year. So you, through these visual seminars, and based upon the numbers that we're seeing from those of you that attended, it's gone very well. Appreciate all of you for logging in every Wednesday or looking at the videos on YouTube after the presentations. Our numbers have been very good, and we've had a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So we're glad that we were able to do it this way. We appreciate it. We thank you for your participation. Some of you may have been to all of the sessions. Some of you, this may be your first one, but regardless, we thank you for joining us. We've actually had a little bit of fun doing this, not as much as if we were with you all, but we've had a lot of fun doing this. So it's been the best that we can do under the circumstances. Now, remember that if you didn't make any of the sessions, you can still review those on YouTube, and you should be receiving a link within the next day or two that has a link to all of the presentations. So if you missed any of them, you want to watch any of them again, we'll be happy to let you do that. And then also look for a note from Adam and I in the next couple of days. We actually have set dates for a live in-person seminar for 2021, and we'll get those dates to you. And we've got a couple of ideas and other things that we'd like to discuss with y'all. So you should get a link with that here in a couple days. The final thank you I need to give is for Stephanie Turner, who put this together for us. You may see her popping in and out on the videos, but she's the one that made this all work. She's done a great job. She came up with the Southwest Airlines theme. So we appreciate everything she's done. She's done a great job. And the final thing is, before I turn this over to Mary, we do have a special presentation, another gift card that I want to give out. Mary's actually going to give one out at the end of her presentation, so stick around for that. So the winner, Emily Case. Emily is the winner of the gift card. Stephanie will send you an email to get that to you in the next couple of days. Thanks again, everybody. I'm going to turn you over to Mary. Mary's got a lot of information. She's great. Make sure you listen to everything she says. I always do. And I'll turn it over to her and she'll take it away from here. Thank you all.
Hi, everybody. Let me get my presentation up. There we go. So the title of my presentation is "We Apologize, but there will be no in-flight beverage service today." We're going to talk today about regulatory concerns for employers during an economic downturn. The items that we're going to talk about today are we're going to start with some cost-cutting measures and different regulations and things that you should be thinking about as you may be implementing cost-cutting measures. And another topic we're going to talk about is considering the impact of these things on different groups of workers. And we're going to finish up with doing some discussion of the WARN Act in some areas where I see employers often get confused. So one of the things that is important is to make sure that if you are experiencing a downturn in your business, that you consider multiple cost-cutting measures, because it is possible that you might be able to avoid layoffs if you can cut costs in other ways. Some key alternatives that we often see to layoffs are reducing salary, and we're going to talk about those. Employees are going to be expecting these during an economic downturn, but of course they're still unpopular. So one of the pieces of advice that we always give to our clients is make sure that you are letting employees know that you're doing these cost-cutting measures to avoid having to do bigger layoffs. Often they go over better when employees understand the bigger context in which these cost-cutting measures are being made. And of course, make sure that you're looking at what regulations might apply. One major thing that employers often may look at is a reduction in hours with a corresponding decrease in pay. This is usually a good option for hourly employees, but it can cause issues with exempt employees, and we're going to talk more about that. Because you need to make sure that exempt employees are still meeting the requirements for the exemptions. Another group of employees that are sometimes overlooked when you're making cost-cutting measures are if you have foreign employees on special work authorizations such as H-1B. There are special considerations for those folks. Okay, we're going to have a bunch of polls during my presentation. Something to remember is I can't see you all. So if you raise your hand, I'm not going to be able to see you on the video and call on you. So please use the question and answer box. Stephanie is here in the room, and when she sees questions pop up, she will try to get to as many as possible. Please remember that we cannot get into very detailed questions that would reveal confidential information about your business. So if it looks like that sort of question, we're unlikely to read it. But if you send us your general questions, we'll try to get to those during the presentation. So our first poll today is true or false. You cannot reduce an hourly employee's pay unless you also reduce the number of hours they are working. Give you guys a moment to Okay, the final 85% of you say that is false. That is the correct answer. You do not have hours that an employee is working, an hourly employee is working in order to reduce their pay. However, you do need to be aware that any reductions need to be made going forward only. You don't want to ever reduce someone's pay after they've already worked those hours. That could be a violation of state law. And make sure before you do that you don't have some employment agreement in place that would limit your ability to cut somebody's hours. You really want to give employees notice of the change in advance so that they can decide not to continue employment if they don't agree to accept that pay cut. And that's the way courts typically interpret it, is if you gave the employee notice in advance that, hey, cost-cutting measures are going into place, we're reducing salaries across the board, and the employee continued to work, then they accepted that new term and condition of employment. Okay, next, true or false. You cannot reduce an exempt employee's salary even during an economic downturn because doing so would violate the salary basis test. Okay, I think we have our answers. 80% of you said that is false. That is, again, the correct answer. You guys are very smart. So long as the salary is reduced prospectively, remains above the minimum salary threshold, and does not fluctuate contingent upon the number of hours worked, you can reduce an employee's salary even if they're exempt, if you do so going forward. And this slide just reiterates what I just said. You need to make sure that that salary is not fluctuating on a regular basis. So you don't want to have their salary go up and down multiple times in a year. Could cause problems. And you need to make sure that they're continuing to make the minimum salary. Right now, that is $684 per week. Okay, next poll. Our foreign workforce must always be treated the same in regard to pay reductions as our U.S. workers to avoid a discrimination claim. This is a harder one. I see varying thoughts on this one. So 56% of you answered true, 44% false. So that's a pretty split decision there. The answer is false. And some of you are going to say, what do you mean? That's totally a discrimination claim waiting to happen. Well, here's the deal. It depends on which foreign workers you have and what status they are in. Foreign employees in certain work classifications like H-1B, for example, have minimum wages that when you file a petition for them, you have promised that you will pay. And also minimum wages that the government requires that you pay. And so for those individuals, you cannot reduce their pay just because you're cutting other people's pay unless you first file a new petition and the new wage you want to pay complies with those regulations. Failure to continue paying the wage that was in the petition that you filed could result in a wage violation and an immigration violation. So I have never seen a case where an employee has made it all the way to a jury on a claim of discrimination because an employer was complying with immigration regulations. So I think it's a pretty good defense. A good rule of thumb, if you're going, well, which of my foreign workers do I need to be worried about whether I can reduce their pay or not? Well, for the individuals who you have specific pay obligations, you would have needed to file something with the government. So someone comes in working on an EAD, that's not the workers where you've made some specific pay obligation to the government. Those workers where you would have filed a petition and said, hey, we agree to pay this wage. H-1B is one. That is the most common. So if you used an immigration attorney to help the employee obtain work authorization to work for you, that is a good signal that you should check with that immigration attorney before you make reductions in their pay, in their job responsibilities, or any other changes in regard to their employment, even if you're making those changes for your other workers, to make sure that you don't need to file an amended petition or there's not some just general bar on you making that change in regard to that specific employee. So moving on to a different cost-cutting measure. Some employers will look for temporary shutdowns and furloughs. Of course, many people had to do that back in April, but on an ongoing basis, where employers are looking to cut costs, particularly around the holidays, some employers will say, okay, we're going to do a temporary shutdown. We're going to let our employees have some more time with their families over the holidays, and then we're not going to pay for those weeks of work. That is, in most situations, acceptable. Of course, if you have a collective bargaining agreement or other written agreements with employees, you need to look at those and make sure you have that ability. And you need to give employees as much notice as possible. For exempt employees, you can even furlough them, but you have to give them the entire week off in order to do a furlough. for them, and you want to make sure that you instruct them not to perform any work that week, and that includes checking emails and voicemails, because if they perform any work, then they are entitled to their full pay for that week. And so if you're going to furlough exempt employees, make sure that you take the extra step of letting them know this is a true shutdown for you. You're not expected to be monitoring voicemail or email. Next poll, true or false? During a furlough, an exempt manager who chooses to spend time responding to employee phone calls and emails is not working because the employer did not require the manager to do so. Okay, so it looks like you guys, I didn't trick anyone on this one. 95% of you say that's false. That is true. As you clearly all know, the issue is not whether they chose or didn't choose to work. It's whether you suffered or permitted them to work. So if you knew they were working or should have known they were working, then they need to be paid. This usually comes up in cases where someone's sending a bunch of emails and the company, the person above them is copied on those emails, so they should have known that the person was working, things like that. Now, one of the things on the temporary furloughs is lots of employers consider doing something such as furloughing people 1 day a week, right? And we're going to reduce everyone's pay by 20%, and they'll only have to come in 4 days a week. Well, how does that work with an exempt employee? Because we typically want to say that exempt employees, their pay should not be based on the number of hours they're working. And so what happens when we tie a pay cut for an exempt employee to working fewer days in the week? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a clear and consistent answer from the courts in that regard. So taking that action, I would say you need to consider it to be somewhat risky. There's a split among courts. There are some courts who have held that this is okay so long as it is done prospectively, because as long as you are cutting the salary and they're still being paid the minimum salary required, that $684 a week, it just doesn't impact the salary basis. However, there are courts who have reached the opposite conclusion, and the Department of Labor says that if you reduce an exempt employee's pay and that reduction coincides with a reduced schedule, it violates the salary basis because you're tying their pay to hours worked. And the DOL thinks that is a problem. Of course, why do we care whether we violate the salary basis? We care because if you violate the salary basis, there is an argument that you now need to pay that that formerly exempt employee overtime in future weeks. So we want to avoid giving plaintiffs any argument that these folks are owed overtime. It may not matter that week because they didn't work overtime anyway, but it would be an argument that they can make toward defeating an exempt status. Another cost-cutting measure that many employers may undertake is forced vacation. Well, how does this cut costs? This is kind of a longer range plan. It may cut costs in that very year if you have a program where you allow payout at the end of the year for employees who have leftover vacation, where you pay out all your unused PTO. Well, if you force people to take a week or two of vacation around the holidays, for example, you can have them use up that vacation time and therefore not have to pay it out in addition to salary. This does not violate the law, but you do want to make sure that your policy allows you to do this. Most people's vacation policies allow the employer to schedule vacation, and in that circumstance, you can take this as one measure to cut some costs. Other cost-cutting measures that we often see are salary freezes or wage reductions, revising paid time off policies going forward to, in Oklahoma, you are not required to pay out unused PTO at termination, but we advise that if you're not going to pay it out, that you make that very clear in your policies. Or even if you want to pay out some, you might decide, okay, but we're going to cap the amount that we'll pay out. Maybe you've always paid out as much accrued vacation or PTO that they have, and you might say, well, we'll pay it out, but only up to 10 hours, 40 hours, something like that. Eliminating travel when possible. Of course, right now, I think people are limiting travel anyway, but it's always a good cost-cutting measure. And some employers may eliminate employer matching contributions or put a hold on them. These are all things that it's important that if you're going to do that, that you give employees notice so that they're not taken off guard. There are also some cost-cutting measures that it's really important to avoid. These are the sort of measures that we have seen over and over again work their way into wage and hour lawsuits. And one is increasing productivity expectations to amount that would require extra work hours, but then telling the employees that they're not allowed to work overtime. What this becomes when it is part of a FLSA claim is an allegation that the employer knew that the person had to work more than 40 hours to be able to get this work done, but that the employer was basically saying you can't record all of your hours worked because you'll go into overtime and you'll get in trouble. So you need to be careful if you are saying, hey, look, we need to all do more, to make sure that you're not giving so much work that it inspires people to work off the clock. You certainly don't want to discourage employees from recording all of their hours worked. And you want to make sure that your supervisors and managers, as much as they want to be productive and have their team really pulling its weight, are not discouraging people from recording all of their hours as part of that. Failing to pay employees for all hours worked. Sometimes this makes its way into a claim as a time shaving allegation that the employees recorded all of their hours, but then it just wasn't paid. Policies that employees will only get paid for overtime if they got prior approval. That's not really appropriate under the FLSA. You can certainly discipline an employee for having failed to get prior approval, but if they worked the overtime, they need to be paid for those hours. Be careful with bonuses that go to managers who approve time cards based on productivity or keeping their team within a certain number of hours. We have seen over and again those sorts of policies being cited by plaintiffs in wage and hour lawsuits saying this inspired my manager, this bonus that they would get inspired my manager to shave my time or tell me not to record my time or, other things that are causing people not to get paid for all hours worked. Also be careful about deciding to move an employee to independent contractor status to avoid tax payments, workers' compensation, etc., even if the employee wants it because they'll have better tax treatment themselves. Even under new independent contractor guidance, it's still a hard standard to prove, especially if the person either was previously an employee or is doing the same work that you have employees doing. And so this is a real area where we see claims later raised by these folks saying, hey, I should have been an employee. Not to mention that you could also have government taxation entities come after you for this, because if you're not treating them as an employee, you're not paying your employer side payroll taxes. Do we have any questions on the wage and hour? We do not. Okay, so we're going to move on to the WARN Act. The WARN Act is the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. As you probably know, it applies to employers who have 100 or more full-time employees, or 100 and more full-time and part-time employees who work 4,000 hours per week, not counting overtime. When you're counting these numbers to see whether WARN Act applies to you, you don't count employees who have worked less than 6 months in the last 12 months, or employees who work on average less than 20 hours per week. You also do not count foreign workers who are outside the US. And if you have any US workers who are typically working in the US, but they're currently assigned outside the country, then you only count them as part of whether you're an employer or not, and not toward the other items that require employee counts that we're about to talk about. Can separate corporate entities be a single employer under WARN? The answer to that is yes. The Department of Labor looks at these 5 factors to determine whether different corporate entities should be considered one employer for purposes of whether you have sufficient number of employees to be covered by WARN. Is there common ownership, common directors and officers, a de facto exercise of control over the various entities, a unity of personnel policies emanating from a common source, and dependence of operations between the entities. So it's going to be very fact specific if your company has affiliates as to whether all of those employees at the different corporate entities need to be counted together as a single employer, or whether they are separate. But if you do have common ownership and directors, and you have one centralized HR department that puts out all of the policies, there's at least a significant risk that you would be considered to be all together as a single employer for purposes of whether those entities are covered under WARN. So when does WARN apply? It applies to plant closings or discontinuations of operating units affecting 50 or more employees. Also to mass layoffs affecting 50 employees and 33% of the active workforce at a single site, or 500 employees at a single site, even if it doesn't reach 33% of the active workforce. So let's say that you have a site that it has 2,000 employees. Well, 500 would only be 25%, but because you reach that 500 number, you would still trigger WARN. So you have to look at whether either of those prongs apply. A temporary layoff that meets the criteria above and is then extended for more than 6 months, or a reduction of hours of work for 50 or more workers by 50% or more for each month in a 6-month period. Now, when you are looking at these numbers, you have to look at all your different types of employment loss, including terminations, layoffs in excess of 6 months, work reductions of greater than 50%, to determine if altogether do those reach any of these threshold numbers. And remember that there's a look forward and a look back period. So if you have different groups of workers who are experiencing these employment losses at different times, you might have to aggregate those together. Remember that plant closings can be permanent or temporary shutdowns, or even of operating units. So maybe your whole plant doesn't have to shut down, but a portion of the plant that supplies a certain item is shutting down. And if it will trigger, you know, an employment loss for a significant enough number of people, that can still be a plant closing, even if the plant is still up and operating in other units. So in counting these numbers, we look at a single site of employment. However, it's important to remember that a single site of employment can refer to either a single location, but sometimes it will refer to a group of contiguous locations. So you can have, within one office building, you could have several different single sites of employment if you have separate employers conducting separate activities within that building. But you could also have separate buildings that aren't directly connected or in immediate proximity to each other that could be considered a single site of employment if they're reasonably close in geographic location, and if they're used for the same purpose and share the same staff and equipment. So if you're an employer and you have two locations that are both within the same metropolitan area, you're going to have to look a little more closely to decide, okay, could this be considered a single site of employment such that I have to count these numbers together, or are they truly separate sites of employment? The DOL has told us that non-contiguous sites in the same geographic area that do not share the same staff or operational purposes should not be considered a single site. And buildings that are even right next to each other, owned by the same employer, but where you have different management teams in place and they're producing different products and they're not sharing a workforce, that those also should be considered separate sites of employment. Okay, so here's our poll. The company has two facilities located in the same metropolitan area, but located 27 miles apart. Facility 1 has 95 employees. Facility 2 has 40 employees. They share ownership, but produce different products. The facilities have separate managers, but both managers report to the same vice president of operations. Workers are assigned to one facility or the other, but may go to the other facility to fill in from time to time. Due to the loss of a customer, facility 2 is going to be closed entirely, and 25 employees at facility 1 will be laid off. Are the employees there entitled to WARN notice? Okay, so the results are in. We have 74% saying yes and 26% saying no. I imagine that different courts could come to different conclusions on this. This fact pattern was actually based on a case out of the District of Kansas, however, and in that case, the court said no, the employees were not entitled to WARN notice. The court looked at this and said, okay, we think this company is likely a covered employer under WARN, that, you know, they have common ownership, they have one vice president of operations that's controlling both facilities. So we're going to put those together as, well, and it was one company in this case anyway. So anyway, the court said, yeah, it's a covered employer. But the two sites were not considered a single site of employment because they produced different products and they had separate managers. And there was no evidence that there was a consistent sharing of the workforce. They might go cover from time to time, but it's not like on a regular basis, the employees clocked in at this facility this day and a different facility the other day. Now, if you were to call me on this and ask me if this was your situation, would I tell you, oh, forget Warren, it's not a big deal? No, a court could come to another conclusion on this. And so it's always safer if you are covered by Warren to give Warren notice when you can. But in this case, the employer did not. And the court said that, in fact, these were separate sites of employment and there was no duty to give the Warren notice. Okay, so the timeframes are always really confusing under Warren, and it always requires a lot of thought if you have a rolling set of job actions. Warren looks at employment losses that occur over a 30-day period. If an employer closes and a plant originally lays off 25 workers, then lays off 25 more workers 25 days later, that's going to be covered, right? That's the easy one where it all happens within a 30-day period. However, Warren also looks at employment losses that occur over a 90-day period, unless you can show that the employment losses are individual events that are the result of separate and distinct actions. So if you are in a situation where you are having to make cuts that extend over the period of an entire quarter, you really need to be looking at, okay, are these cuts all part of the same reason, or do we have really clear and distinct separate reasons why this part is getting cut and then this other group is getting cut? On day 35, company terminates 10 more employees due to the continuing need to cut costs. The total terminations are now 40 with 108 remaining employees. On day 65, company terminates 9 more employees for the same reason. Total terminations are 49 employees. The total terminations are 59, and we have 89 remaining employees. Is the company liable to any or all of these 59 employees for failure to provide warn notice? Seems like you guys are getting pretty stable here. We're right around 80% saying yes and 20% saying no. And those of you who said yes are right. Even though the company fell below the 100 number for being a covered employer, after the layoff on day 65, and the company had still not reached the warn trigger number of 50 on that date, The date on which the company size is measured for purposes of coverage under WARN is the date the notice should have been given, which is 60 days before the first layoff. So because of how this happened, the employer was a covered employer when it should have given the notice. And therefore, yes, these employees should have received WARN notice. Now, when you do give WARN notice, that 60-day advance written notice should go to the union representative or to each affected worker, also to the Oklahoma State Employment Security Division, and to the chief elected official of local government. So the mayor, if it's, you know, in a city that has a mayor, just whatever the chief elected official in that local government is. So I hope we have some questions. We haven't had many pop up during the actual conversation. So I'm happy to answer. Oh, we have a couple. Oh no, this is a gift card. Do we have any questions, Stephanie? No? I'm going to give you guys a couple of seconds to share any questions that you might have. And then we do have our last, this is the last one, right, Stephanie? Our last gift card winner. And I hope you guys take note on this page how we have some new faces on this screen. We've recently had Katie Campbell and JC Booth and Caroline Lindemuth join us as associates, and it's so good to have their smiling faces on this slide. Anything popping up? Nope. Okay, well guys, I guess we get to have a short day today. Our Southwest Airlines gift card winner for today is Shayla Watts. Again, Shayla Watts. Stephanie will contact you this afternoon to coordinate the delivery of your gift card. And if you still have questions, you can send them to us even after this webinar. You can always email info@crowdunlevy.com, or you can email me, mary.snyder@crowdunlevy.com. I think a question might have just popped up.
I was actually saying Shayla, she was saying thank you.
Oh, it's not a question. Shayla was just saying thanks. So thank you guys all so much for joining us on this last of our virtual seminar. And we sure look forward to seeing your actual live shining faces next year. Have a great day.